Thank you, Wendelin. I think I cannot escape the light. Anyway, so we will continue to the third speaker, and I hope by this time we can start to figure out or thinking about this different possibility of sound and how the complexities of sound are often being reduced, for example, to create this universal language of volcanoes, or even by going through this complex sound, we kind of find a different existence of independency, that both dependent and independent, in as what we see in Wendelin's work, that sometimes the sound and the image are connected, sometimes not. We are start to think who are the one who speaks and not. Without continuing too much or doing my own presentation here, I'm going to continue to the third speaker, Carolyn. I have also a short bio here. Carolyn Birdsall is Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Her publications include Nazi Soundscapes, Sound Technology and Urban Space in Germany from 1933 to 1945, published in 2012, and a special issues on sound archiving in the humanities and social sciences, which will be published in autumn 2017. Her new book examines the early history of radio archiving and concepts of documentary sound in Europe. Please, Carolyn.
Thanks so much for the introduction and the invitation, Dina, Ferdi, and all of your colleagues. And I'm very pleased to be able to join the conversation this afternoon about the intersections between decolonial research, artistic practices, and knowledge production. I'm also very pleased to present, following up from Adam and Wendelin, with Adam's contribution highlighting for me the importance, in the vein of decolonizing methodologies, to consider the relationship between imperialism and research, with a particular attention to how listening techniques and practices have been bound up with colonial knowledge production, power relations, and regimes of truth. So, here, the archive and what has been left out is particularly relevant. And Wendelin's work also highlights for me this question of investigating other archives and transnational relations prompted by the industrial circulation of people, textiles, style, and technologies. And for me, this device of the loop and iteration as producing audiovisual entry points for questioning colonial legacies, infrastructures, and modes of embodiment and labor. So I like particularly the echoes that we heard, where we heard the acoustics of the museum space and the archive stacks. That was particularly resonant. So my short contribution today responds to the question in the symposium description about what are the modes of study that we can utilize to better understand colonial past and the present, and what modes of learning or unlearning should be employed. So I work in media studies, so my response to this is, on the one hand, in relationship to current research, and on the other hand, as I think about the place of sound, listening, and audio technologies within teaching during a period when our faculty is discussing what a decolonization of curriculum should mean, and as my colleagues and I are in the middle of planning a course, in fact, this morning, on post-colonial media studies. And here you can see a recent Dutch language piece that two of my colleagues, Reza Kartozen-Wong and Leonie Schmidt, have written about this task of decolonizing the university curriculum in general, but also for media studies in particular. I'll come back to this question in a moment. The departure point for these questions in my own research, situated in the field of sound studies and media history, is the observation in our present moment that there are ever more sound preservation projects in the European context, most of which treat recorded sound heritage in terms of positive expressions of culture, particularly national culture, such as national songs and anthems and language, and tend to downplay how such sound recordings may have been created in the context of imperial knowledge production and framed in terms of particular racial epistemologies. So in terms of my own research, I was previously concerned with histories of sound technology and urban environments, thinking about the role of embodied listening in relationship to power structures and difference and otherness in Weimar and Nazi Germany. So this new work I'm doing, which is, you start to see some new publications, examining the emergence of radio archives in late 1920s Germany and elsewhere in Europe, in a period when in Germany imperial fantasies and imaginations were prevalent following the loss of the colonies after World War I. So my work is examining the ways in which radio broadcasting as a modern media institution inherited earlier models about sound archiving from around 1900, and in the German case, this is with the formation of national phonogram archives, and in World War I with collections such as the Berliner Lautarchiv, which created and stockpiled sound recordings of Allied and colonial prisoners of war for the purposes of analysis in linguistics, musicology, and other disciplines. For these earlier histories, I would refer you to the work of Erica Brady's study that emphasized the influence of the phonograph on ethnographic method and collection practices around 1900. And also for the World War I case, colleagues like Britta Lange and Annette Hoffmann, who have studied the relationship between listening, sound recording, and archiving, and the colonial disciplines in the German language region. So in the late 1920s, German radio archives also acquired collections of ethnographic sound recordings as part of these new collections. And I found examples how these collections were reframed in the context of radio production and were used partially as typical sound effects of languages and places. So we have a reframing of earlier collections and recordings and a kind of stripping of provenance and context at play. So to sum up, I'm interested here in questions of heritage, preservation, circulation, and reuse, and rather than see radio or other media as neutral channels, my argument is, just like phonography, photography, and film, radio broadcasting from the late 1920s onwards provides us with a site for the engagement of both ethnographic researchers and subjects, so people like Jaap Kunst presenting their collections on radio, so we have sort of a science communication context, and also radio as an institution that actively builds its own sound archives with icons of national cultural heritage and samples of languages and musics of the world. So perhaps it's worth pointing out that the European and North American radio also hosted large-scale annual exhibitions for which radio's modern culture of display was often attached to popular presentations of ethnographic sound collections. So often these researchers were brought in as pioneers of sound recording and then sort of integrated with an affiliation to modern radio culture. And it's also a reminder of the economics of sound recording, which was costly and cumbersome, whereby radio lecture and commercial publications served as an important source of revenue. So we have a sort of an economics and systems of value at play here as well. So I'm going to sort of leave that for now. So that's the background where I'm thinking about some similar questions also in relation to what Adam has brought up. And I'm going to turn back to education, and I'll end with the museum context in order to think about the ways of thinking about the place of sound and listening, and how sound is sometimes bracketed out as too hard to teach, or as in the museum context as merely decor, addition, or atmosphere. In recent conversations, I've noticed that people keep on coming to me and telling me that they now want to learn how to do sound, since they feel comfortable in analyzing written and visual discourse. And in some of these cases, there's an idea that sound might have the potential to be less objectifying than the visual. In other cases, there's this idea that methodologies like sound walks and field recording might actually free researchers and teachers from some of the problems of image-based methods. As someone who's written about the politics of sound, listening the voice, I sometimes I find this idea of finding refuge in sound a bit disquieting. And I think that a useful intervention can be found in Jonathan Stern's The Audible Past, in which he calls for us to be a bit more mindful about what he's dubbed the audiovisual litany, in which we might affirm sound as being about the subjective, affective, and ephemeral, and the visual about the objective and the fixed, let's say. So I think the lesson of recent sound history and sound technology scholarship has precisely been to consider how sound in modernity has been bound up with processes of rationalization, modern science, and professional listening techniques. And in the little time that remains, I'll just say a few words about two courses I'm involved with at the university, and what we do with sound listening and audio technologies. So the first example is an elective course I've taught on and off for a number of years, both alone and with other colleagues. And the course description, if I just look at it now, promises a fairly wide scope, but names as its core multiple and overlapping sound cultures and a focus on the cultural politics in which sound cultures are embedded. So already from week one in this course, we discussed post-colonial perspectives on sound, but also challenges to this field of sound studies, which itself has tended to emphasize North American, Western European case studies and perspectives. And we also talk about recognizing the West's othering of sound as primitive as a longer-term discourse. In week 4, the students received as an assignment, so I taught it last year, the task to attend the screening and Q&A of a short film, Voices by the Portuguese, Netherlands-based artist Miguel Pérez dos Santos, and to address the question how the film thematizes decolonization and how voices appear in the Dutch public sphere. So here we have again an engagement with the broadcast archive in the Netherlands, and this idea that it's a kind of recurring theme in the film, that the fact that one is able to speak does not mean that one has a voice. So, this was really an entry point with students to start asking questions, not only about the politics of voices, but also about, let's say, silencing and traces in the archive and what this particular artist has been doing to, challenge the Dutch Broadcasting Archive, which, as I understood it, doesn't have the word decolonization in their metadata, or at least that word wasn't there when he was trying to find material about Curaçao and uprisings in Curaçao and what happened at a certain moment when migration, or let's say larger scale migration to the Netherlands occurred, and how violent attacks and incidents were being reported and discussed. So I think this is like one way in for me with students to start asking questions with them about not only media and representation, but also archives and the work of audiovisual techniques in revisiting some of these prior moments. I'll skip ahead for the interest of time. This is a course where questions of colonial knowledge production and post-colonial perspectives, I was able to deal with that from the beginning and through the whole course, and yet, as I, this morning with my colleagues, prepare a new course on post-colonial media studies, I started to realize in this general framing that we are not talking about sound. So at some level, and I think I'm participating in that, there's a bracketing out of sound as too hard to teach. There's an idea that it's easier to teach written and visual discourse. And in the first draft for our course, which we discussed this morning, we have no reference to sound or sound technologies or listening or the voice or anything about sound media production. So this is also, or radio. So it's also helps me think about the ways in which, in one context, something that I see as important is absolutely front and center. And then even when we move to the topic of post-colonial media studies, I'm also participating in this idea that sound is not an easy object to listen to analyze, to engage with in the classroom. Light is also important, of course. So just to end, I guess where these questions I have about sound in teaching and also some of these bracketing out, in both of these cases we're dealing with elective courses, so not core courses. So I think this is a question that's been coming up also for your discussions about what is in the permanent collection and what is in temporary exhibitions, and to what extent do we have a dialogue between potentially more critical temporary exhibitions and perhaps, let's say, difficulties with permanent exhibitions and their narratives and what's included and what isn't. And so I think probably if I would just end on this question of the temporary versus the permanent, or at least the fixed, I would just like to raise some questions about to what extent, also as the Tropenmuseum is preparing to rework or reconfigure certain aspects of the permanent displays, how we might deal with sound not only as decor, addition, or atmosphere, as a temporary intervention, but we might also try to think in the sort of Anne Stoller vein about sound really as an object and not just as a source in these spaces. And so it's also a question, I guess, for KUNCI, do we continue to use the audio guide and radio as potent interventions in these spaces, or do we want, in a way, those sounds to be heard beyond the headphone as well? So it's really a question that I'm thinking about where sound is placed and how permanent or invisible is it in the museum space. And I think it really is also a question about, if we go back to education, about this potential for unlearning, for the improper education that you have been developing with KUNCI, and also, I guess, the languages of knowledge production. So what kinds of entry points we might have for a decolonial practice. Thank you.